The clouds overhead hung low and heavy, the promise of snow lingering in every crisp inhalation of air. Winter had not yet fully come, though there was a solemnity in the sky that spoke of the long cold nights that would soon descend across the north. Sentries on the walls of Winterfell raised their eyes from time to time, scanning the distance for any sign of riders on the horizon, though no messenger birds had arrived that morning. Still, they hoped. Rumors had been swirling like so many restless crows, the Boltons gathering strength at the dread fort, plots contrived, alliances sundered. Yet on this day, the courtyard remained as quiet as a temple, each step across the ground seeming amplified by the hush. Beneath the arch leading from the courtyard to the Great Hall, Ser Roderick Castle's successor, Ser Els Tan, a man of middle years with a tireless sense of duty, observed the comings and goings with a guarded expression. Though he wore the Stark sigil on his cloak, the air was tense. Even so, children ran to and fro, their laughter a gentle reminder that life persevered. Old Nan's great-granddaughter, a bright slip of a girl, was giggling as she chased a scrawny cat across the cobblestones. The cat darted close to Ser Elstan's foot, and the knight found himself smiling despite the heaviness in his chest. At the heart of Winterfell, seated within the Great Hall, Sansa Stark ran her fingertips lightly across a map of the north. Once, in simpler times, the shape of each holdfast and region on that map had been as familiar to her as a beloved tapestry. Now, every name felt fraught with tension. She had been forced to learn the political distances just as surely as the geographical ones. Her dark auburn hair fell in careful waves around her shoulders, her face showing a calm resolution she had not possessed in her youth. She had outgrown her naive hopes of a perfect world. Instead, she had become attuned to the shadows that lurked in the corridors, both physical corridors of the castle and metaphorical corridors of ambition and betrayal. She studied each marked stronghold. Their alliances were shifting as quickly as the winds. Boltons, Karstarks, Umbers, Manderleys, each had threads connecting them to the Starks. But the Boltons had declared themselves wardens of the north during the chaos that followed King Joffrey's death and the War of the Five Kings. The rest of the realm had largely recognized them by default, and for too long, Winterfell had been subject to the treacheries and cruelties of House Bolton. But there was new hope, vague though it might be. Whispers said that the Baratheons, still reeling from the storms of civil war, had not forgotten old allegiances. And if there was any truth in those rumors, Sansa wanted to be ready. She could not bear another false hope, but nor could she ignore the promise of a possible ally. Outside, a sudden cry startled the children away from the corner of the yard. A small group of riders appeared at the gates, bearing a sigil that was difficult to make out at first. Squires rushed forward, and the watchers on the walls tensed. Spears clinked against stone. Then a bright voice carried over the courtyard, "We come in peace. By the grace of Lord Stannis Baratheon, rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms." The speaker was a stocky man clad in a worn cloak that bore the stag of House Baratheon. "We carry word for Lady Sansa Stark." A ripple of astonished murmurs traveled through the courtyard. The sentries exchanged uncertain glances. No one had anticipated an envoy from Stannis of all people, though there had been rumors of his presence at the wall, rumors of a battle with the wildlings, rumors that he had turned his eyes toward the traitors who had seized Winterfell. But none had expected him to send men to talk instead of simply to challenge. Sansa, upon being informed, ordered they be brought to her in the Great Hall. When the Baratheon men strode through the large wooden doors, they were cautious in every step. Their leader, who introduced himself as Ser Gawain Wyatt, bowed deeply. "My lady," he said, voice echoing. "I come bearing words from King Stannis." He gently reached into his satchel, withdrew a parchment, and presented it with a solemn flourish. Sansa accepted it, gingerly breaking the seal. Her eyes flicked along the lines of the message, meticulously scribed. Her breath caught. "He promises his protection to the rightful guardians of the North in exchange for fealty." She spoke it softly, as if tasting the syllables in her mouth, uncertain whether it was a blessing or another scheme. Those courtiers and guards close enough to hear rustled with excitement or trepidation. Stannis Baratheon had been an enigma to the North, rigid, unyielding, but honest to a fault. If this was genuine, it could mean deliverance from House Bolton. But as ever, the cost might be high. Sansa thought of her father and how, once upon a time, Robert Baratheon and Ned Stark had been the closest of friends, forging the rebellion that toppled the Mad King. She wondered if some lingering sense of that old friendship was what drove Stannis to intervene now, or if it was pure calculation. But in her quiet reflection, she felt a trickle of hope. "My lady," Ser Elsan ventured from her side, "it might be prudent to summon your bannermen. If this is true, if Stannis truly intends to shield Winterfell from the Boltons." She nodded, setting the parchment aside. We must be cautious, but we cannot ignore this opportunity. She turned to Ser Gon. Thank you for your message, Ser. I offer you the hospitality of Winterfell. We shall see that you and your men are fed and given a proper place to rest after your journey. That night, the great hall glowed with candlelight. The winter winds rattled the shutters and a light snowfall dusted the roofs, but inside it was warm, the air thick with anticipation. Ser Gon and his small entourage had been seated near the high table. They ate and drank politely, speaking in low murmurs, occasionally answering polite inquiries from those around them. The hush in the hall was broken only by the clinking of cups and the low crackle of the hearth fires. Sansa, in a place of quiet authority, found herself reflecting on the new shape of alliances. Winterfell had not recovered fully from the damage inflicted during the wars, the betrayal of Theon Greyjoy, and the subsequent partial restorations. Entire sections of the castle had needed repair. The resources of the land were strained. Many loyal men had been lost to the ravages of war. There was still a sense among the people that House Stark was their moral heart, but had not the Boltons managed to terrorize them into near submission? Yet hope was a powerful thing, especially in the north. The notion that a southern king, one with a Baratheon stag upon his banners, could come to defend the ancient seat of House Stark was stirring a sense of fervor in the courtyard. Already, pockets of loyalists were speaking of rallying arms, forging alliances. When the hall emptied for the evening, Sansa retired to the Solar, accompanied by Brienne of Tarth, who had pledged herself to Sansa's service. Tall as any man, strong as any knight, Brienne stood sentinel at the door while Sansa penned letters to be sent out by Raven at first light. She wrote to the Manderleys, to the Glovers, to the Serwins, to the lesser houses that might rally to the Starks if they believed real aid was at hand. She spared no detail, explaining that Stannis Baratheon had reached out, that they might be able to expel the Boltons once and for all. She had no illusions. All of them would weigh their choices carefully. Many would balk, too afraid to stand openly against the Boltons. But she placed her faith in old loyalties as she sealed each missive with the direwolf sigil. As she finished the final letter, she blew on the hot wax and stared into it as though searching for an omen. Far away, in the heart of the Dreadfort, Ramsay Bolton idled in a chamber strewn with animal pelts. He lounged on a chaise, a wolf's fur draped across his lap. Nearby, his steward waited, a shape of stony discomfort. Ramsay had been receiving disturbing tidings of Baratheon men venturing south from the Wall, but the news had seemed too uncertain to provoke alarm. It angered him more than worried him. If Stannis was indeed meddling with his affairs, that meant a threat to Bolton dominion. And yet, he almost welcomed the challenge. A sardonic grin tilted his lips as he considered the idea of meeting Stannis in battle. Though the Boltons had fewer men, Ramsay believed cunning and cruelty could easily even the odds. Winterfell, old as it was, had often changed hands. He knew that some of the North's lords still bristled at the Boltons' rule, no matter what fear he sowed in their hearts. Now, a confrontation seemed all but inevitable. Ramsay rose, advancing through dim corridors lit by smoky torches until he reached a room where a captive was chained. The pungent smell turned his stomach in that strangely pleasurable way. He was too restless to engage in his usual amusements, but he stole a glance at the prisoner anyway, inhaling a trembling breath. Then he slammed the door shut. He would ride to Winterfell soon, or at least send an envoy. The Starks might have gleaned some measure of confidence from Stannis' approach, but Ramsay intended to show them the cost of such misguided hopes. All he needed was time to gather his father's men to cow their vassals yet again. If war was coming, he was prepared to greet it with blood and terror. In the days that followed, Sansa Stark received her replies. Some were cautious affirmations of support, while others were polite refusals veiled behind concerns about the Boltons' retribution. The Manderleys, still strong in White Harbor, wrote back that they would wait to see Stannis' commitment. The Glovers expressed concern about the cost of open war, but they didn't outright refuse. The Serwins, smaller and closer, indicated a willingness to support if the Baratheons truly marched north in force. Reading these letters late at night, Sansa closed her eyes in silent prayer to the old gods. If only that force would arrive soon, they might unify under the Stark banner again. Ser Gon Wyatt remained at Winterfell, delivering messages back and forth between the castle and his traveling messengers who ventured north to Stannis' base near the Wall. Bit by bit, news returned that the Baratheon forces indeed were making preparations. Siege weaponry, hardened knights, sells words from Essos who had pledged to Stannis, and scattered northern volunteers whose homes had been pillaged by wildlings or burned in the wars now banded together under that rigid, grim king's banner. Though none could say precisely when Stannis would march, the buzz in Winterfell grew. The battered castle found a new spirit. Blacksmiths hammered at forges night and day, forging swords, axes, arrowheads. Tailors stitched new cloaks bearing the stark direwolf, while children carried small practice swords and dreamed of heroics. Meanwhile, Sansa's silent vow to keep Winterfell safe echoed daily in her mind. She had lost so much, her parents, her siblings scattered or dead, her illusions. But she had gained a quiet strength. Now, she found herself walking the ramparts at twilight, remembering the days when she and her sister Arya had bickered about trivialities, remembering how her father would stand near the battlements, gazing upon the winter skies with calm acceptance. The wind stirred her auburn hair, and she let a single tear slip before commanding herself to remain strong. Brienne of Tarth found her there once and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The taller woman, so often out of place at courts, had become one of the few comforting presences in Sansa's life. "Whatever war is coming," Brienne said softly, "I shall protect you and your home with my life." Sansa reached up to squeeze her sworn sword's hand. "I know, Brienne. I only hope we can protect everyone else too." As days lengthened into weeks, the watchers on the ramparts began to see more movement on the roads. A small throng of men approached from the north, and though they didn't bear the dread sigil of the flayed man, neither did they openly carry the stag of House Baratheon. A hush fell across the courtyard. The gates opened to greet them, wary eyes scanning for any hidden threat. In the lead rode a grizzled man of the mountain clans, or so it seemed from his furred garb and the way he held himself. He introduced himself as Tormund Giantsbane, once a wildling who claimed to have brokered peace with Stannis. He also claimed to have fought alongside Jon Snow at the Wall, an oath brother to Ned Stark's bastard. The presence of a free folk warrior, once considered an enemy of the realm, caused a stir among the guards. But Tormund was unflinching. He asked to speak with Lady Sansa. She greeted him in the great hall with polite reserve. Tormund was not a man well versed in southern courtesies, but he attempted a ragged bow that drew a half-smile from Sansa. He was direct. Stannis Baratheon had mustered enough men at Castle Black and Eastwatch by the sea and was ready to march toward Winterfell if the roads allowed. However, they needed further provisions, shelters for the nights, and guaranteed paths through friendly territory. The wildlings among Stannis' host numbered more than a few thousand men, women, and children who had bent the knee to the king rather than face extermination. Tormund had come ahead to ensure that the gates would be open to them when they arrived. His words sent a quiet ripple of shock through the hall. Some of the present lords and ladies were unnerved by the notion of letting wildlings roam freely on Stark land. But Sansa considered the necessity of the arrangement. She thought of Jon Snow, how he had pleaded for understanding regarding the free folk, how he believed them deserving of a chance to escape the horrors beyond the wall. The memory ached. Jon had been lost, or so they all believed, but Sansa could honor his convictions. She inclined her head to Tormund. "We will show them hospitality. We will not turn them away. I trust that Stannis' men will see that discipline is maintained. But let us be clear, my people have endured decades, centuries of fear regarding the free folk. I pray you will be mindful of that." Tormund grinned, wide and fierce. "If anyone tries to harm us, we'll defend ourselves. But I didn't march all this way to pick a fight with some farmer's boy. We want to settle the question of the Boltons. That's your enemy and ours." Those words gave Sansa a bitter sense of camaraderie. Indeed, if the wildlings were prepared to stand against the Boltons, she had no quarrel with them. She summoned her castellan, gave instructions to start stockpiling additional stores for the coming host. Winterfell's resources weren't vast, but they would do what they could. The entire keep buzzed with the news, free folk, knights, sellswords, and the king himself all converging. In the corners of the courtyard, men began sharpening their blades with renewed vigor. Meanwhile, in the shadows, a pair of Bolton spies slipped away to dispatch hurried messages to the Dreadfort. They carried enough intelligence to confirm that Stannis truly was forging an alliance with House Stark, just as earlier rumors had warned. Ramsay, upon receiving that news, wasted no time. He began to rally the Bolton forces, small but fierce. His father, Roose Bolton, had left for the Frey stronghold to secure that alliance by marriage ties, but Ramsay had enough authority to command the local bannermen. With threats and coin, he mustered their numbers. He intended to lay a trap. Let Stannis come, let him bring his ragged men. Ramsay would ensure they found Winterfell a grave. Days later, the first outriders of Stannis' forces finally appeared along the King's Road, trudging through a swirl of early snowfall. A solemn hush fell over Winterfell as horns sounded from the ramparts. Sentries reported a large caravan, thousands strong, marching under the crowned stag banner. Some carried torches despite the daylight to ward off the deepening chill and guide supply wagons across half-frozen rivers. As they approached the ancient fortress, the men on the walls exchanged uncertain looks. They had welcomed loyal bannermen before, but never such a mixed and ominous array. At the front rode a column of Baratheon knights in battered but well-maintained armor that bore the marks of battles at the wall. Interspersed were the wildlings, some with furs and bone-decorated weapons, others with battered steel looted or given by the king's quartermasters. At times, a few near the rear carried large crates rumored to contain weaponry gleaned from the blacksmiths at Eastwatch. The entire assembly looked war-weary but grimly determined. At the head of the column, astride a tall warhorse as dark as midnight, rode King Stannis Baratheon himself. Even from the ramparts, his piercing gaze seemed to cut through the distance. Age had lined his face further since last many had seen him, but the set of his jaw was iron. His cloak of thick wool billowed behind him, pinned at the shoulder with a golden stag. Melisandre, the Red Priestess, rode beside him on a pale mare, her flowing red robes a stark contrast to the whitened road. A hush seized the watchers. Whispers circulated. She was rumored to wield magic from a foreign god, rumored to have conjured shadows. None knew the full truth, but her presence only heightened the sense of awe and dread that trailed this army. Sansa descended from the ramparts, flanked by Brienne and a handful of Winterfell's sworn knights. The gates creaked open, and she stepped forward into the swirling winter air, her heart pounding in her chest. She found herself face to face with the man who claimed the Iron Throne, a man who now wished to preserve House Stark. She curtsied, her cloak heavy on her shoulders. Stannis dismounted in a fluid motion that belied his age and offered her a curt nod, which to a less perceptive eye might have seemed dismissive, but Sansa recognized it as an acknowledgement. "My Lady Stark," said Stannis in a voice as harsh as the wind off the bay. "You have done well to maintain your father's stronghold. We come now to put an end to the bastards who dare usurp what belongs to you and your house. Will you accept our hand and bend the knee as the Warden of the North under my reign?" All eyes waited on Sansa's response. She felt the weight of centuries on her shoulders, the ghosts of her ancestors watching from the old godswood. She had prepared for this moment in her heart. It was not a simple thing to kneel to any southern ruler. The North had its pride, its traditions. And yet, if Stannis truly did intend to honor the old friendship, it might be the best hope for her people. Slowly, she knelt in the snow, her voice calm and clear. "Your Grace, I, Sansa of House Stark, the rightful Lady of Winterfell, pledge my fealty to you in exchange for your protection from the traitors who call themselves Wardens of the North." Stannis inclined his head, a rigid acceptance. "Then rise, Lady Stark. We have a war to plan." As he gestured for his men to proceed into Winterfell's courtyard, Melisandre rode past, her red robes trailing across the churned snow. She cast Sansa a small, inscrutable smile. The look made the younger woman's spine prickle. She sensed something dangerous, something otherworldly, but there was no turning back now. She led Stannis into the great hall as the castle's men hurried to find space for the newcomers. Some squires peeled off to tend to the horses. Others escorted the wildlings to designated areas outside. To the main keep, tensions ran high between Northmen and free folk, but so far no violence flared. Everyone was too weary, too cold, too aware of the greater threat. Within the hall, bread and salt were offered to Stannis and his commanders, fulfilling the sacred tradition of guest right. He accepted them without flourish, then seated himself at the table that Sansa had used as her war council. The old chairs creaked. Maps, parchments, and messages cluttered the wooden surface. Candlelight flickered across the lines of Stannis' face, making him seem carved from granite. Melisandre stood behind him, a faintly triumphant air about her, as if she saw in this meeting the movement of destiny. Sansa took a seat opposite the king, and her knights and advisors flanked her. Brienne remained standing, a sentinel of caution. Stannis surveyed the map. "We shall not wait long to strike. If the Bolton whelp is mustering men at the Dread Fort or here in Winterfell's shadow, we must meet him swiftly before he can gather more strength." He directed a curt glance at Sansa. "Do you have knowledge of how many men he commands?" Sansa swallowed. We estimate around 3,000, but it could be more if House Umber or House Karstark join him. Some lords are too frightened to defy the Boltons. Others truly hate them. It's difficult to know who will stand on which side when the lines are drawn. Stannis rapped his knuckles on the table. We cannot rely on uncertain bannermen. We strike fast, we strike hard. Ramsay Bolton is cunning and cruel, but he will not withstand a disciplined army. I have survived battles that would make lesser men flee. Tormund Giantsbane, who had come inside as part of the War Council, crossed his arms. And we have men who know nothing but harsh lands and savage fights. We aren't afraid of some pink-flayed man. He spat. Though I'd be lying if I said I didn't find that sigil of theirs unsettling. At that, a brief flash of dark amusement passed through Stannis' eyes. They mean it to be unsettling, which is why we cannot give them the advantage of fear. He turned again to Sansa. I trust you know these lands better than anyone at this table. Show us where the Boltons are weakest. She pointed to the area northwest of the Dreadfort. This land is forested. The roads are poor. If we can move an army through here, we might catch them off guard. However, if the Boltons discover our approach, they'll send outriders to harry us. They might also burn the forests if they have time. The Boltons are known for savage tactics. Stannis nodded grimly. Then we must move soon. My men will rest for no more than 2 nights in Winterfell. Then we march. A hush followed. This was the moment the North had been craving or dreading, a full confrontation that could free Winterfell from the Bolton grasp or condemn them all to some new horror. Sansa lifted her gaze to meet Stannis's. And Winterfell? He seemed to read her question. I will not leave your seat unguarded. My knights and a contingent of wildlings will remain here to ensure that no Bolton riders take you by surprise. Once we secure the land, you and your people shall be recognized as the loyal warden of the North under the Iron Throne that is my birthright. That night, the fires in Winterfell blazed bright. Men and women gathered in the halls, corridors, and around the big hearths, exchanging stories of battles and losses. Some prayed to the Seven, others prayed to the old gods, and still others kept to the red god, Lawler. The swirl of cultural differences made for a tense harmony at best. But for one fleeting moment, the sense of unity against a common foe held them together. Sansa walked among them, offering calm words where she could. She saw the stony determination on the faces of Baratheon knights who had marched far from home. She saw the distrust etched into the expressions of northern small folk who eyed the wildlings with fear. She saw the defiance of the free folk who refused to bow to any southern code. And amid it all, she felt the ghost of her father's presence, as if Ned Stark stood behind her, quietly proud. She was forging alliances, preserving Winterfell. She was doing what he would have done as best she could. In the darkest hour before dawn, she made her way to the Godwood. Snow drifted gently, covering the ancient trees in a layer of white hush. The heart tree, with its carved face, stood watch over the small pool, ever red-eyed. She breathed deeply, folding her hands in front of her. She thought of her sister Arya, of Bran and Rickon, even of Jon. So many tragedies had befallen them. Now, at this precipice of a new war, she prayed that the old gods would show them mercy. Unbeknownst to her, Stannis was not sleeping either. In another corner of the castle, he conferred with Melisandre. The Red Woman's voice was a mere murmur in the gloom, yet it seemed to fill the chamber with an ominous undercurrent. This war is part of a larger struggle, Your Grace, she intoned. The flames show me shapes, a wolf with a crown of snow, a stag with a burning sword, and a flayed man clutched by shadows. Light must triumph over darkness. Stannis' lips twisted. Your riddles are of no use to me unless you can ensure victory. The North must be secured. He believed in the Lord of Light, or so he told himself. He had come to trust Melisandre's visions enough to heed them. But he had seen that her promises did not always bear out precisely in reality. He was not naive. Still, the presence of Ramsay Bolton was an evil he could name, an enemy he could crush. If the gods saw fit to guide his hand, so be it. He would unite the realm under the rightful monarchy, or die trying. On the morning of the third day, the main column of Stannis' forces departed Winterfell, leaving behind a defensive garrison. Sansa stood atop the walls, watching them win their way out of the gates. War horses trudged through the snow. Wagons rattled. Foot soldiers stamped their feet to keep warm. The bright red hair of Melisandre shone like a distant spark amid the gloom. Tormund marched near the front, barking orders to a group of free folk archers. Several lords loyal to Stannis, including Ser Justin Massey and Lord Wensington, rode at the king's flanks. The tension seemed to coil in Sansa's stomach like a restless snake. She prayed that the Bolton defeat would come swiftly and that the land would be spared more cruelty. Brienne stood at Sansa's side, scanning the departing army. "I should be with them," she said, voice quiet. "I vowed to protect you, yes, but I also vowed to avenge your brother's murder. I hunger to face the Boltons. They were complicit in the Red Wedding, in the downfall of your house." Sansa knew well the ache of vengeance. She gently placed a hand on Brienne's mailed arm. "We have a role here, Brienne. Winterfell cannot be left undefended. If the Boltons surprise us or if there is betrayal, we must be ready." Her eyes drifted to the distant horizon. "I have lost too much of my family. I cannot bear to lose my home again." Brienne nodded solemnly, though the frustration lingered in the tense line of her jaw. "Then I shall stay by your side." They lingered a moment longer before heading back into the castle. Winterfell felt emptier with the departing army. While still full of life, the corridors echoed a quiet dread. There would be no turning back from this point. Sansa found it difficult to sleep that night and the one that followed. She caught fleeting reports from the outrider Stannis left behind, each message no more than a snippet. The Bolton riders had been sighted along the eastern foothills. The weather was turning harsher. The king pressed on. The tension grew day by day. Then, one morning, horns blared beyond the walls of Winterfell. Sansa, jolted awake in her chambers, rushed to dress. Brienne and Ser Elstan met her in the corridor, swords already belted to their hips. "Riders approach!" a guard shouted from a tower window. Sansa's stomach clenched. "Are they ours?" No immediate answer came, so she and Brienne hurried out to the courtyard. Snow crunched beneath their feet as they crossed to the gate. A line of ragged men came into view, led by a knight whose horse was lathered with sweat and blood. The banner he clutched was the Stag of Baratheon, tattered and stained. The gate wardens let them inside, and the men practically collapsed, exhausted. Ser gone? Sansa recognized him from earlier, though he seemed a shell of the man who had first arrived. He dropped from his horse, breath steaming in the frigid air. "My lady, the Bolton host. They met us at the eastern ridge." His words came out in fits and gasps, and one of the stable boys helped him keep steady. "They had more men than we expected. Karstark men, and some of the Umbers must have joined them. The king he fights on. He told us to warn you." The Boltons broke off a smaller force, heading toward Winterfell from the west. "Perhaps they plan a pincer." Sansa's eyes widened. She'd feared as much. The Boltons had cunning on their side. They might not have the numbers alone to face Stannis, but with new alliances they could stand a chance. And if they sent a detachment to Winterfell, they intended to lay siege, or worse, infiltrate the castle under cover of the chaos. "How far away?" she asked. Ser Gon shook his head. "A day behind us at most. Maybe 2. We rode as fast as we could. The king is pinned. Our lines are holding for now, but it's not assured." Sansa looked to Brienne, who gave a grim nod. There would be no safety in waiting passively for news. "We'll prepare the defenses. Winterfell is not as strong as it once was, but we'll bar the gates, place archers on the walls, and call every man to arms." Brienne's blue eyes flashed with resolve. "We can hold. The stone walls, the battlements, these will help offset our fewer numbers. If we can hold until the king prevails on the eastern ridge, he can return to relieve us." At once, the castle stirred like a hive kicked over. The watchers on the walls were doubled. The blacksmith hammered out new arrowheads, scarcely pausing to wipe the sweat. Archers lined every vantage point. Sansa ordered that every kettle be boiled, every available pitch ready to pour on attackers. The small folk who could wield a weapon were organized into militia groups. Ser Gon was too wounded for the battlefield, but he advised them where best to place the defenses, drawing upon his knowledge of siege tactics. Nervous tension laced the crisp air. And then, as night fell on the second day, the horns sounded again. "Riders on the horizon," called a sentry. Not many by the look of it. Sansa's heart pounded. She rushed to the battlements, Brienne beside her, a swirl of snow creeping through the arrow slits. Indeed, a small troop of Bolton riders advanced cautiously. Their torches looked like fireflies against the dark sky. At their head rode a figure in dark leathers and furs. Even from a distance, the hound's sigil pinned to the fur cloak was unmistakable. A flayed man. "They can't break these walls with so few," muttered Ser Elstan. Brienne clenched her gauntlet hand around her sword hilt. "They may be testing our mettle, or they might be seeking parley." As if on cue, the figure at the front raised a horn to his lips and blew a single, sharp note. It echoed eerily across the snow. "Parley!" a voice boomed. Sansa narrowed her eyes. A chill danced over her skin, more from fear than cold. Should she meet them at the gates or risk letting them inside? She thought of how once the gates had been opened for a smaller group of Ironborn, and Winterfell had been betrayed from within. But ignoring a request for parley might spark immediate hostilities. She exchanged looks with Brienne. The tall warrior shook her head, caution in her gaze. Ultimately, Sansa decided to speak to them from the battlements. She would not risk them stepping inside. "Who comes to Winterfell?" she called, voice carrying over the walls. A man's laughter sounded below, chilling in its familiarity. "Ramsay Bolton. I have come for what's mine," he shouted up, his tone jaunty, as though this were a mere game. "Parley, Lady Stark. Let us discuss the terms of your surrender. I promise you I can be quite merciful." Sansa's stomach twisted. She recalled the nightmares that had plagued her after hearing of Ramsay's misdeeds. She forced herself to stand tall. "Your house has no rights to Winterfell. Leave now, or face the consequences when King Stannis returns." Her words drew another burst of mocking laughter from Ramsay's men. "Ah, but the good king won't be returning, my lady. He is pinned down by our allies. Soon enough, he will be nothing but a body on the battlefield. I offer you a final chance to save your people from torment. Open the gates. Kneel before me and my father's house, and I promise your folk will be spared." His voice lowered, dripping with threat. "Refuse, and we will tear these walls down. You may hide behind your fancy archers, but my men will find a way in. I will feed your flesh to my hounds, the same way I fed them." Brienne cut him off, shouting from the walls, "Do not address Lady Stark so. You'll find no fear in this keep. We know the measure of House Bolton's cruelty, and the North will not bend to you any longer." Ramsay tilted his head to see who spoke. For a moment he seemed intrigued. "Ah, the tall wench. So they still let you speak. How gracious." His voice slithered with malice. "Very well. You've made your choice. I shall give you 1 day to reconsider. At dawn on the next day, if your gates remain shut, we'll attack. Enjoy your final night of false hope." With that, Ramsay yanked on his reins, spinning his horse. His small band of riders retreated out of arrow range, likely making camp beyond the treeline. Sansa stared after them, her heart thudding with an urgency she fought to hide. Night enveloped the land in an oppressive shroud. The temperature plummeted, and the wind howled around Winterfell's towers. She could almost sense the Bolton men out there, waiting with cruel anticipation. Inside the great hall, the mood was grim. Someone had lit the braziers, and the flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Sansa gathered her captains, Brienne, Ser Elstan, Ser Gawain, bandaged but present, and a handful of the more battle-hardened men. They looked to her for leadership for the final decision. "We do not surrender," she said, setting her jaw. "We hold these walls. Ramsay Bolton cannot be allowed to terrorize the North another day." Ser Gawain nodded, a fierce light in his eyes. "Then we prepare for siege." They spent the night bolstering every defense. Archers occupied each tower with extra quivers. Cauldrons of pitch stood ready. The gates were double-barred, the portcullis tested, the walls manned. Sansa passed among the men and women, giving what encouragement she could. Though fear lurked in many eyes, there was also a determination hardened by years of suffering. The North remembered. They would defend their seat or die trying. Before dawn, Sansa found a moment to herself in the old sept that had once served her mother, near the southern wing. The floor was cold beneath her knees as she bowed her head. She prayed to the mother, the warrior, the stranger, any aspect of the seven who might lend an ear. She prayed that the men on the battlefield fared well, prayed that Stannis broke the Bolton line. She prayed that her father's spirit would lend her courage. The silence of the sept answered with only the faint drip of melted snow off the eaves. When the pale light of day finally broke across Winterfell's walls, the horns rang out once more. From the battlements, Sansa saw the Bolton detachment forming rank beyond arrow range. There might have been 500 men, perhaps more. Not enough for a lengthy siege if Stannis returned soon, but enough to wreak havoc if they found a way inside. They brought a ram, visible on a sled, and siege ladders. Sansa's heart constricted. She looked to Brienne, who offered a steadfast nod. Hours passed in tense waiting. The Bolton men remained just out of range, assembling their gear, occasionally shouting taunts that carried on the frosty air. At times, they banged weapons on shields in a grim cacophony. Within the walls, Winterfell's defenders waited with bows drawn, swords in hand. The air smelled of fear and pitch. Many prayed. Children were ushered into the crypts for safety, along with the elderly. Then at midday, the Bolton horns sounded. A wave of men broke off at a run, carrying ladders and grappling hooks, aiming for a section of the walls that had only recently been repaired. Arrows flew from Winterfell's defenders, reaping men in the snow. Bolton archers returned fire from behind wooden mantlets, but found it challenging to gain vantage. Meanwhile, a second wave began hauling the battering ram toward the main gate. Sansa stood atop the ramparts, stoic despite her heart hammering. Brienne and Ser Elsen gave orders, directing the archers, calling out vantage points. The clash of steel was audible even from above as a portion of Bolton men tried to scale the partially rebuilt wall. Boiling pitch poured down from cauldrons, forcing attackers to scramble away with screams of agony. Another cluster, aided by ropes with hooks, managed to latch onto the parapets, but Sansa's men hacked furiously at the ropes with axes. At the main gate, the ram hammered against the timbers with a heavy, resonant thud. Again and again, each slam shaking the hearts of those inside. Still, the gate held. Archers on the walls poured arrows down into the mass of men around the ram, thinning their ranks. Bodies littered the ground as the Bolton men struggled to maintain their assault. Yet it was clear, Ramsay had no qualms about throwing bodies at Winterfell's defenses if it meant eventually breaching them. Minutes turned into hours, an unrelenting exchange of arrows and steel. Sansa moved along the battlements, encouraging her defenders. Now and then she glimpsed pockets of Bolton men making progress up the walls, only to be pushed back by a surge of Northmen. The snowdrifts below turned red with blood. At intervals, horns sounded, rallying the attackers. Winterfell's own horns answered with defiance. The air was thick with the stench of burning pitch and the copper tang of blood. Ramsay himself was not visible on the field. Likely he waited behind the lines, letting his men do the brunt of the work. Sansa suspected he would only appear once the gate had been compromised or the walls breached. She loathed him more deeply with each passing moment of bloodshed. As the afternoon wore on, exhaustion frayed both sides. The ram fell silent, momentarily abandoned as the Bolton lines withdrew slightly, regrouping. Within Winterfell, men sank against the stone, panting, battered. Some of the defenders had suffered grievous wounds, and a few pockets of the wall's defenders needed replacing. Ser Elsen, sporting a bleeding gash on his temple, reported to Sansa that the portion of the wall near the old broken tower had taken damage. She mustered more archers there, hoping it would hold. Then came another wave, a concerted push at multiple points. The Bolton men struck with renewed ferocity, fueled by their lord's savage demands. Ladders slammed against the walls. The ram swung into position once more. Guttural war cries tore through the bitter air. Sansa's forces fought valiantly, but their numbers were limited. Slowly, painfully, the Boltons gained a foothold near the broken tower, pulling themselves up onto the rampart and engaging in desperate sword fights with the defender. Brienne, sprinting across the battlements with her Valyrian steel sword raised, dove into the fray. Her blade flashed, cutting down a Bolton man who had just driven a spear into one of Winterfell's archers. The tall warrior roared in defiance, her hair swirling in the wind, and led a small group who managed to push the attackers off the parapet, sending them tumbling down with screams of anguish. Across the courtyard, another shout went up, they're breaking through the gate. And Sansa's heart twisted in her chest. She raced with Ser Gawain to the walls above the main gate, looking down. Indeed, the reinforced timbers were splintering, cracks spiderwebbing out from each point of impact. If it gave way, the Bolton men would flood into Winterfell's courtyard. Sansa gave the order to dump the last barrels of pitch, which rained fiery death upon the ram's operators. Screams and the smell of burning flesh filled the air. But more men rushed in to take their place, hacking and heaving. The gate, battered for hours, was close to yielding. And then, above the din, a fresh horn blast sounded. It came from the west, echoing off the snow-laden trees. Both defenders and attackers paused, uncertain. Another horn answered, this time from the distant east. The entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath. From the vantage point of the walls, Sansa strained her eyes. In the distance, she saw movement, flags flapping in the wintry wind. It was a mix of black and gold, or so it seemed. The stag of Baratheon, the dire wolf of House Stark. Could it be Stannis, returning from the eastern ridge? A murmur spread among her men. The Bolton soldiers, too, turned to see what new host approached. Panic rustled through their ranks. Then, with a roar like thunder, a tide of mounted knights and wildling spearmen crested over a small rise, charging the rear of the Bolton forces. The clangor of weapons resumed with brutal intensity. Trapped between Winterfell's walls and Stannis' returning army, the Bolton men found themselves in disarray. Shouts of warning mingled with curses. Sansa's defenders rallied, picking off attackers who turned to flee or defend themselves from the sudden onslaught in their rear. Stannis' knights crashed into the mass of Bolton foot soldiers, scattering them, while wildlings fought with savage glee, their axes and spears claiming vengeance for old grudges. Amid it all, a mounted figure brandishing a flaming sword, Melisandre's doing, some said, cut a path, the blade's fire reflecting in pools of blood on the snow. Seeing the tide turn, Sansa shouted encouragement to her archers, who rained death on the disordered enemy. The battered gates still held, but only just, and now the Bolton men were either fleeing or being trapped in a pincer. A chaotic swirl of fighting ensued, with pockets of Bolton troops collapsing, surrendering, or dying. The ground was treacherous with gore. Sansa scanned the battlefield for a sign of Ramsay. If he were truly leading this attack, he might now be among the fleeing or hidden away. Off to the side, in the swirling chaos, she glimpsed a figure in black leather spurring a horse away from the main fray, heading north. She was certain it was him. But with Stannis' cavalry in pursuit, Ramsay would find no easy path. At last, the Boltons broke. Some men threw down their weapons, others tried to flee. Stannis' host gave them no quarter, though perhaps some mercy was shown to those who surrendered promptly. A triumphant cry rose from the defenders on the walls. Sansa closed her eyes briefly, relief washing over her. The gamble had worked. The alliance with Stannis had saved them. As the gates finally opened, no longer battered from without but now swung wide to admit the returning king, Sansa rushed down to meet him in the courtyard. Stannis' armor bore new rents and stains of fresh combat. He dismounted stiffly, his face drawn with the grim satisfaction of victory. Melisandre, her flaming sword extinguished, dismounted behind him, an unreadable expression on her red lips. "It is done," Stannis said, his voice low. "Though Bolton and some of his men escaped us on the field, the bulk of his force lies in ruin or captivity." Sansa held his gaze. "Thank you, your grace." He nodded, surveying the battered walls and the bodies that lay in heaps outside the gate. "You fought well, Lady Stark. The north is secure. Once we deal with the remnants of Bolton treachery, House Stark shall be restored fully." Over his shoulder, Sansa spotted Tormund Giantsbane trudging in, bloody but grinning, along with a battered formation of free folk. Baratheon knights corralled a group of Bolton prisoners. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of death. Yet amidst that horror, a sense of relief settled upon Winterfell's defenders. In the coming hours, the Bolton prisoners were sorted. Those who had once been forced to fight under threat of torture found some leniency, while the most fanatical of Ramsay's men faced swift justice. Sansa saw Brienne stride through the courtyard, blade still in hand, her expression unyielding as she oversaw the disposal of Bolton corpses. Indeed, much remained to be done, repairs, burials, the chase for Ramsay. But the siege had been lifted. Winterfell's banners would fly unbroken. Come dusk, Stannis and his senior commanders met with Sansa in the Great Hall. Though weary, they had cause for celebration. Ale and bread were distributed, the barest feast they could manage under the circumstances. The flicker of torchlight on the worn walls gave the moment a dreamlike quality. Sansa raised a cup. To those we lost, to those who fought, and to those who proved that the North will always rise again. A ragged cheer went up and cups clinked. Among the assembled, Tormund slapped a wildling comrade on the back, and a Baratheon squire smiled in hesitant camaraderie. For one shining moment, they were united. Stannis inclined his head, acknowledging Sansa's toast with uncharacteristic solemnity. Perhaps in his eyes he saw the seeds of a realm he could rule justly, forging alliances that would not break. Or perhaps he was already planning the next campaign to solidify the Iron Throne. Either way, for tonight, victory belonged to them. Sansa left the hall eventually, seeking the godwood again. This time, she found quiet among the snow-laden branches. She knelt by the heart tree, placing her hands on the rough bark, and exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. Winterfell was free from Bolton rule. House Stark stood again, no longer alone in the north. Tears slipped down her cheeks, a mingling of grief for the lost and gratitude for the living. She tilted her face to the etched eyes of the weirwood. "Thank you," she whispered to the old gods, to her father, to every spirit that had guided her. Behind her, the distant sound of voices raised in triumphant or mournful songs drifted from the hall. The wind carried them, a testament to the resilience of these people. New alliances had been forged, old friendships rekindled. The Baratheon stag sheltered the Stark direwolf as once Robert had stood beside Ned. And though the future would no doubt bring further storms, for this night at least, Winterfell stood in a fragile peace, embraced by the winter wind and the unyielding loyalty of a kingdom finally coming home. Winterfell settled into a cautious calm in the days following the Bolton defeat. By the grace of King Stannis Baratheon and the courage of its defenders, the ancestral seat of House Stark stood liberated from the grip of Ramsay Bolton. Yet the aftertaste of war clung to the stones like old blood, and though victory had been won on that snowy field, the north was not yet free of danger. For every prisoner locked away in Winterfell's dungeon, there were rumors of scattered Bolton men lurking in the hinterlands. Ravens carried tidings of confusion in Carhold and the last hearth, of hesitant lords who had not known which way the battle's winds would blow. And Ramsay himself remained at large, fleeing with a small retinue toward unknown shadows. Winterfell had not forgotten his threats. Sansa Stark, as newly recognized Lady of Winterfell, felt a hollow knot of dread in her stomach each time she recalled his final vow. He would return, or so the whisper said, and the cost might be unimaginable. Still, there was work to be done, and Sansa had never shrunk from necessary duty, not anymore. With the gate repaired and the walls manned by loyal guards, she turned her focus inward. She oversaw the counting of Winterfell's stores, mindful that winter continued to creep closer. Though they had begun to put away supplies during the short respite before Stannis arrived, the siege had taken its toll. The main granaries needed replenishing, and the harvest from scattered fields had been meager, thanks to the Boltons' extortion of farmers and the earlier depredations of petty raiders. Sansa weighed these concerns gravely. If the North was to rally under a Stark banner again, she would have to ensure no one starved come deep winter. She summoned local stewards, gleaned scraps of information about which farms might still have hidden stores of grain, what flocks of sheep still grazed in the surrounding hills, and how many casks of salt fish remained in the cellars. The numbers were sobering. Tormund Giantsbane, who roamed the courtyard with a mild sense of wonder at living so far south of the wall, assured her that the free folk could hunt if need be. Yet there remained the question of how well the wildlings might cooperate with ordinary northern folk once they ventured beyond the walls. Sansa needed to maintain order. So, with Brienne of Tarth at her side, she met with Tormund to formalize a small rotation of hunts, ensuring wildlings would not plunder smallfolk farms or livestock. Tormund grumbled that nobody told him how or where he could hunt, but he understood the necessity. As he said with a fierce grin, it was better to eat fresh meat in relative peace than starve or face retribution from farmers with pitchforks. King Stannis himself spent much of the aftermath in strategy sessions with his commanders. Though he had saved Winterfell, his larger goal remained the Iron Throne. At least, that was the declared mission. In hushed corners of the castle, some men muttered that Stannis' claim was overshadowed by talk of the Targaryen girl in Essos, or that Tommen sat in King's Landing with the power of the Lannisters behind him. But Stannis would hear no contradiction. He believed fervently in his right, burnished by the righteous flames of Lawlor. Sansa gleaned from half-heard conversations that Stannis intended to secure more of the north before pressing southward, hoping to sway loyalists who still revered her father's memory. Perhaps in forging a strong alliance with House Stark, Stannis hoped to harness the North's storied resilience as a springboard for his wider conquest. Such maneuvers did not disturb Sansa in principle. She had pledged fealty, and she was grateful. But she worried for her people. Generations of Northerners had often chafed under what they saw as Southern meddling, and she could already detect the stirrings of resentment among some. A handful of Winterfell's older retainers recalled the days when Ned Stark ruled in near autonomy. Now that a Baratheon king marched across their homeland with wildlings in tow, that sense of independence was jarred anew. Sansa was determined to walk a delicate line, show loyalty to the man who had rescued her seat from the Boltons, yet guard her people against exploitation or forced conversions to the Red God. No easy task. Amid these complexities, a more immediate concern loomed. The whereabouts of Ramsay Bolton. The first outrider Stannis sent did not locate him. The northern roads were many, winding through forests and tundra. Meanwhile, ravens brought tidings of houses Karstark and Umber. Some claimed the Karstarks had lost faith in both Bolton and Baratheon, retreating behind their walls to wait out the storm. Others claimed that the Umbers were in turmoil, with some lines supporting the old loyalty to the Starks, others coerced by Bolton threats. Sansa found each rumor weighed on her mind. She dreaded the possibility that Ramsay might slip into one of those strongholds, forging a new base from which he could strike. Stannis approached her one evening in the Great Hall, the firelight flickering across scarred tapestries and the faces of tired men. He had a letter in hand, freshly arrived from Castle Black. The Night's Watch has heard that a group of Bolton riders, led by Ramsay himself, was seen crossing the Long Lake, heading east. Their presence was confirmed by free folk scouts in that region. It seems he aims to reach the Dreadfort or find allies among the mountain clans. Possibly he seeks to slip around our lines altogether. He set the letter down on the table, its wax seal broken. I intend to send another contingent to search for him before he regains a foothold. The man is too dangerous, too unpredictable. Sansa nodded, her face set. I'll speak to my own watchers. Perhaps we can coordinate. If we find any sign of Ramsay, we'll alert you immediately. The North must see him brought to justice. He and his father's crimes must not stand. Stannis gave a curt nod. For all his stiffness, he seemed almost respectful in that moment. Agreed. He must answer for what he's done. The realm will not suffer a stray rabid dog, let alone one bearing the sigil of a flayed man. With that, plans were made. Baratheon soldiers and free folk scouts prepared to ride out in multiple directions. Sansa set her own men to watch the roads, to keep track of any rumor or whisper of Ramsay's passing. If the dreaded bastard turned up near Winterfell, they would capture or kill him on sight. Tormund, for his part, seemed eager for the chase. He found himself bored within the confines of a castle, longing for the open land. He boasted that if he caught Ramsay in the wild, he would bring back the man's head as a trophy. On the morning the search parties departed, Winterfell's courtyard was abuzz with activity. Horses stamping, men double-checking saddlebags, and stable boys scurrying about. Sansa stood at the gatehouse, Brienne on one side, Ser Elstan on the other, observing the final preparations. One of the search leaders was Ser Justin Massey, who had proven himself in the clash that saved Winterfell. He offered Sansa a sober bow. "We'll find him, my lady, one way or another." As the columns of riders moved out, the air thick with the promise of fresh snow, Sansa felt a knot of tension coil in her chest. She wished she could ride out herself if only to see justice done with her own eyes. But her place was in Winterfell, shepherding her people through the rebuilding. She watched the riders vanish into the distance, hoping for their swift and successful return. That evening, Sansa convened a gathering in the library, an old room lined with dust-laden tomes and battered ledgers. She invited the minor lords from the surrounding countryside who had pledged loyalty when Stannis arrived, along with a few representatives of the local gentry to discuss the next steps in re-establishing Stark rule. The library was cramped, the air thick with the musty smell of parchments, but the flickering candlelight gave it a comforting glow. Sansa sat behind a heavy oak table wearing a simple gown of gray wool with the dire wolf sigil embroidered at the collar. Brienne stood near the door, discreet but watchful. Lord Serwyn, a wiry man who had barely escaped Bolton punishment months prior, rose to speak. "My lady, we are grateful for Winterfell's liberation. Our small folk have lived in fear these many moons. Yet the land is scarred. We cannot hope to pay full taxes come spring if we have no seeds to plant or livestock to breed." Sansa nodded. "I understand. We will not impose burdens beyond reason. I propose that each lord or landholder keep only 1/4 of any remaining seed grain for themselves and set aside the rest for shared planting. We must ensure as many fields are sown as possible or none of us will eat well when the snows truly set in." A murmur of agreement and caution spread among the assembled. Lord Serwyn acknowledged the logic, though he worried about unscrupulous neighbors. Another man pointed out that the road to White Harbor was not secure, meaning trade could not easily replenish their goods. Sansa promised to write to Lord Wyman Manderley at White Harbor, hoping to re-establish safe convoys. She knew the Manderleys had always been among the wealthiest houses in the north and might well be able to assist with shipments of grain or salted fish. But the ghosts of recent wars haunted them too. Manderley had once feigned loyalty to the Boltons, biding his time for the right moment. Whether he would wholeheartedly support the new Baratheon-Stark alignment remained to be seen. Still, the meeting ended on a note of guarded optimism. Plans were laid. The North might rally if they saw real stability under Stark stewardship. For Sansa, it was a moment of quietly earned pride. She was doing the work her father once did, forging alliances, ensuring justice, keeping the peace. Yet she was no longer the wide-eyed girl who dreamed only of songs and chivalry. She knew that alliances could break, that cunning and cruelty lurked behind kind masks. She would remain vigilant. That same night, beneath the moonlight, Sansa wandered through the Godswood once more. The Heart Tree stood silent sentinel amid fallen snow. She placed her gloved hand on the trunk, the carved face's eyes seeming to watch her with ancient melancholy. In the hush of that sacred space, she offered thanks to the old gods for the measure of success they had granted and prayed for the safe return of those who hunted Ramsay. She found herself also wondering about her siblings. Arya, Bran, Rickon, scattered or lost. The ache never disappeared, but sometimes it felt dulled by the responsibilities pressing down on her. She lifted her gaze to the weirwood's crimson leaves, half lost in the swirl of snowflakes. "I hope you're proud of me, Father," she whispered. "I'm trying." In another corner of the castle, Melisandre stood in a small private chamber that Stannis had allotted for her rituals. A brazier glowed with orange flame, reflecting off her red robes. She chanted in the language of Ashai, voice low and throbbing, stirring the hot coals. Now and then, sparks rose into the dim air, painting flickers of light across the ancient stone walls. Stannis stood nearby, arms folded, lines of fatigue etched into his brow. "What do you see?" he asked, his tone brusque but laced with expectation. Melisandre stared into the flames, her eyes wide and dark. She murmured half-formed phrases, saw images dancing in the fire. A black wolf, a broken crown, a swirl of snow turning red, a monstrous shape with ice-blue eyes. She frowned, pressing her lips together. "The future remains clouded," she said at last. "There is a new path forging in the north. The rightful king has laid claim, and the wolves stand beside him, but I see a darkness. Cold, a deadly cold that extends beyond mere winter. An ancient threat stirred once more, and in the heart of that threat, I sense something." Stannis ground his teeth, impatient. "I've heard these warnings. The Night's Watch speaks of White Walkers returning, though few in the southern realms believe it. I do not dismiss the threat, but I can't ride off to fight phantoms when the Iron Throne remains in the grip of usurpers." Melisandre's voice dropped low. "And yet, Your Grace, if we ignore the true enemy, all our battles for crowns and thrones may come to naught." NSE that the one known as Jon Snow might have a role to play. She paused, gazing again into the flames. "If only we knew." Stannis's expression hardened. He had heard rumors that Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell, had been betrayed at Castle Black, perhaps even killed. Some said he still lived, others that he had vanished beyond the wall. The truth was elusive. "Dead men do not lead armies," Stannis said at last, turning away from the brazier's glow. "For now, we focus on what we can conquer. My duty is to press onward. The north has been secured in part, but we must quell the last of Bolton's holdouts. Then we turn south." Melisandre closed her eyes. "As you will it, Your Grace." The next day, Sansa received an unexpected visitor, a knight from House Glover who arrived in Winterfell's courtyard with a small escort. House Glover had always been close to the Starks, but the wars and the ensuing chaos had forced them at times to bend the knee to the Boltons. The knight, Ser Goric Glover, was a gruff man in his 40s, sporting a neatly trimmed beard flecked with gray. He bowed low before Sansa in the great hall. "My lady," he said, "I come with tidings from my lord brother in Deepwoodmont. He wishes to reassert our house's loyalty to House Stark. We have no love for the Boltons. Though we were forced to capitulate, we never forgot the old ties. But my brother also warns that men loyal to the flayed man remain active near Barrowton, perhaps seeking alliance with the remnants of House Frey. My brother begs your counsel on how to proceed, and he hopes to meet with you directly to ensure that House Glover and House Stark stand united under the new regime." Sansa felt relief that at least some old alliances were re-emerging untainted. Yet the mention of Barrowton and the Freys chilled her. The Freys had been deeply complicit in the Red Wedding and unspeakable betrayal of House Stark. If that twisted branch of the family still conspired in the north, it posed a direct threat. She took a measured breath, forcing calm. Your brother is wise to seek counsel. I will dispatch a royal envoy, some of King Stannis' men and my own knights, to Deepwood Motte. We'll cement our renewed friendship. Meanwhile, I ask that House Glover prepare to defend itself if any Frey or Bolton force attempts to encroach on your lands. Ser Gorick nodded. We shall be ready, my lady. My brother also asked me to gift you a small token of our enduring loyalty. He signaled to his squire, who stepped forward, presenting a fine embroidered cloak bearing the Glover sigil, a mailed fist woven in subdued red threads. We pray you'll wear it in good health, a sign that our houses stand together again. Sansa accepted the cloak graciously, her smile weary but warm. Tell your brother I'm deeply thankful. Soon we shall see a north free of those who wronged us. Within hours, she arranged a formal response, drafting a letter to Lord Glover. She also proposed that, in due time, she would journey to Deepwood Motte herself if it seemed safe. She wanted to show the flag of House Stark in person, reassure the northern lords that Ned Stark's daughter was neither a figurehead nor a captive to southern ambitions. Certainly, traveling far from Winterfell carried risks, but forging trust was paramount. She sealed the parchment with the dire wolf sigil and dispatched it by Raven, hoping the lines of communication would remain open. Winterfell endured more small shocks in the days that followed. Searching parties came and went, sometimes bringing in a Bolton soldier or two, half-starved and lost, sometimes returning with no success. Ramsay himself remained elusive. Word trickled in that the dread fort had been partially emptied, as if expecting an attack. Sansa heard from a captured Bolton officer that the new Lord Bolton, Ramsay's father, Roose, still had men in place, but he was strangely silent, no doubt shaken by the defeat at Winterfell. Some said Roose was trying to salvage alliances with the Freys or to call upon debts from the Lannisters. Others whispered that father and son were at odds, that Roose might be content to remain in the shadows, leaving Ramsay to run wild. In the midst of these uncertainties, an unexpected development arrived at Winterfell's gates, a messenger from the Wall. He wore black garb, slightly tattered, and introduced himself as a steward of the Night's Watch. Gaunt with cold and exhaustion, he asked urgently for an audience with King Stannis. Sansa granted it in the Great Hall, summoning Stannis from his war council. The black-clad steward knelt, breath steaming in the drafty corridor. Your Grace, he said, voice quivering with tension. I bring dire news from Castle Black. The Lord Commander, we fear he's been killed. There's chaos among the brothers. Some are loyal to his memory, others claim new leadership. And rumors swirl that a large party of wildlings, those who didn't bend the knee to you, have been seen massing beyond the wall. The watch is severely undermanned. Stannis's face hardened. The Lord Commander I left in charge was Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell. Is it he who's rumored to have been killed? The steward's eyes flicked to Sansa as though he recognized her as Snow's half-sister. Aye, your Grace. We cannot confirm it fully, but the mutineers among the watch talk of having stabbed him and of something unnatural afterward. Some say his body vanished. Others say he rose again. The stories are madness, but we are rattled. Sansa felt a shockwave course through her. She had known that Jon commanded the Night's Watch, that he was near Stannis for a time, but she had not heard these details. Pain knifed through her at the notion he might be truly gone, or that something monstrous had taken his place. She tried to keep her composure, but her hands trembled. Then we must send help, she said, voice cracking slightly. If the watch collapses, the entire realm is in peril. House Stark has always protected the Wall. Stannis listened, face grim. I left some of my men at the Wall when I marched south. They'll hold what they can. But this changes matters. If the watch truly is in disarray, we may face a threat from beyond the Wall again. His gaze darted to Melisandre, who lingered near the hall's edge in silence. What counsel does your red god offer on this? She stepped forward, the hem of her crimson robes brushing the stone floor. I have seen shapes in the flames that suggest the Wall is key to the war against darkness. If the Lord Commander has truly perished, we lose a valuable ally. But the fires also showed me an image of a man with snow-white hair rising from death, touched by flame. The visions are unclear. They may point to something yet to come. The steward swallowed hard. Your Grace, I beg you to dispatch forces north. If wildlings who never bent the knee to you gather, the watch cannot hold alone. Stannis rubbed a hand across his stubble jaw. I will consider it, but I cannot strip the north of defenses. The Boltons remain a threat. He turned to Sansa. My lady, I did not expect to divert my forces so soon. Yet I sense you would urge me to assist the Watch, for the sake of your father's vows. Sansa caught her breath, torn between the immediate threat of Ramsay Bolton and the ominous news from the Wall. At last she nodded. The safety of the realm could be at stake. We cannot ignore the Watch's plight. If the stories of White Walkers are true, and my brother Brandon once believed them, then the Boltons might pale in comparison. At the very least, we must find out if Jon truly died. She could not finish the sentence without her voice breaking. So it was that Stannis promised the steward a moderate detachment of cavalry and foot soldiers to shore up the Watch's defenses. Another division would remain in Winterfell to continue hunting Bolton stragglers. In return, Sansa pledged that the men of the Starklands, whatever militia forces and loyal knights they could muster, would fill the gap left by Baratheon troops heading north, ensuring Winterfell remained secure if Ramsay attempted a return. Sansa felt uneasy, but it was the best compromise. The following morning, those assigned to march for the Wall prepared in the courtyard. The steward who brought the message thanked Sansa profusely. She only managed a tight smile. She wished she could ride with them, perhaps to learn the truth of Jon's fate. But she could not abandon Winterfell, not with chaos still lurking. Instead, she wrote a letter addressed to Jon Snow, 998th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, or whomever else holds that seat, praying it would reach some friend at Castle Black who could tell her what truly transpired. A day later, another group of riders appeared on the southwestern approach, this time, men bearing the triple spiral sigil of House Manderly. At their head rode Wylis Manderly, the heir to White Harbor, a man of impressive girth and jolly demeanor, though rumors said his temper was fierce in war. He requested an audience with Lady Stark. Sansa met him in the great hall where the large man knelt awkwardly, his belly straining the fine clothes he wore. Lady Sansa, he boomed in a surprisingly merry voice, for such troubled times we are here to pay respects to the true Warden of the North. My father, Wyman Manderly, sends his compliments and has instructed me to open White Harbor's resources to Winterfell's cause. We remember who once protected our city from Ironborn raiders. We remember the debt we owe House Stark. Sansa felt relief. Another cornerstone of northern might offered its hand. Your presence gladdens my heart, she said, her voice resonating through the hall's hush. We are in need of trade and supplies. Your father's generosity does not go unappreciated. Wylis gave a hearty grin. He also sends a cask of our finest White Harbor ale, hoping to thaw the chill that grips these halls. May we drink to House Stark's resurgence. A flicker of genuine warmth touched Sansa's features. We will. Though this hall has seen dark days, you bring tidings of hope. Over the next hours, details were hashed out. The Manderleys would provide shipments of grain and fish up the White Knife, ensuring Winterfell's stores were bolstered for the coming winter. In exchange, House Stark pledged fair trade rates and offered to assist with patrols on the roads leading to White Harbor. There was a note of caution. The phrase still lurked, and Lord Wyman Manderly had once engaged in cunning plots against them, plots rumored to involve hidden murders and stealth retribution for the Red Wedding. The phrase had demanded Lord Wyman's fealty in the past, but he had played them as needed. Now, with Bolton power in question, the phrase might redouble their efforts to hold on to any scraps of influence in the north. Thus did the days pass, filled with negotiations, supply counting, and the faint hum of hope. Winterfell slowly returned to something resembling normalcy. Smiths plied their trade without fear of random punishment, children ventured outside to play at being knights, old men gathered by the hearth to swap stories. Sansa found a moment here and there to catch her breath, to sip warm spiced wine and reflect on how quickly the tide had turned. But each time she grew comfortable, the memory of Ramsay's mocking smile came back to taunt her. Until his menace was put to rest, she would not truly sleep soundly. About a fortnight after the siege had been lifted, a major search party returned with news. They had not captured Ramsay, but they brought back a cowering man who claimed to be one of Ramsay's personal servants. The fellow's face was gaunt, eyes haunted. He babbled of how Ramsay had forced them to camp in the open for days, how men deserted him one by one, and how the bastard lord grew more desperate. He aims for the Dreadfort, my lady, the servant gasped, kneeling on the stones of the courtyard. He said he'd make a stand there if no one else would follow him. But I fled when I could. I couldn't stand it anymore. Sansa studied him with cool scrutiny. You are wise to surrender yourself. But if you lie, she left the threat unspoken. A single nod from her was enough for the guards to drag the man away to the dungeons for further questioning. Yet the intelligence likely rang true. The Dreadfort was the Bolton's ancestral seat, well fortified and infamous for its grim dungeons. If Ramsay reached it, he might attempt to muster a last-ditch defense. Though how many men remained loyal to House Bolton was a mystery. Sansa approached Stannis that same afternoon. She found him in the solar, poring over a map of the eastern north with several of his knights. His jaw was set. When she relayed the servant's story, his eyes narrowed. The Dreadfort, yes. I had expected as much. If Ramsay lurks there, we should press the advantage before he can gather enough strength for a proper defense. Sansa drew a breath. I'd like to join you on that campaign. Winterfell's forces should be represented if we are to root out the Boltons once and for all. This concerns my house directly, Your Grace. Stannis studied her for a moment, brow furrowed. A battlefield is no place for you, Lady Stark. You are needed here, and the Dreadfort's walls are formidable. It will not be a swift conquest. True, she conceded, but if you succeed, the North must see a Stark claim that seat, if only to ensure no illusions of Bolton power remain. Besides, I trust my Castellan and the men left here to keep Winterfell secure. We can't appear absent in the final stand. Silence weighed in the chamber. The knights exchanged uncertain glances. In the old days, few would have permitted a highborn lady to accompany an army, especially on an offensive siege. But times had changed, and Sansa sensed that the northern folk would want to see her asserting her rights. Stannis nodded reluctantly. Very well. But you'll remain protected. We march within 3 days. And so began the steady mobilization. Baratheon forces, combined with newly rallied Stark loyalists, prepared for a slow push eastward. Word was sent to the Manderleys and the Glovers, calling for detachments. Though the North was weary of fighting, many recognized that bringing down the last of House Bolton was a cause worth mustering for. The Dreadfort's dread had cast a long shadow over the region, and if Sansa could help end that legacy, so be it. On the eve of departure, Sansa joined her men for a final review. Spearmen assembled in the courtyard, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Horses stamped restlessly. Stannis' knights, stern and disciplined, formed ranks near the stables. The Red Priestess Melisandre lingered on the periphery, drawing uneasy glances from the northern soldiers who didn't care for the foreign god. Sansa said a few words of encouragement, though her voice nearly caught in her throat. The memory of the last siege was too fresh, the cost of war too heavy. But the men who heard her words stood a little straighter, shoulders squared. They believed in the Stark name. They believed they were finishing a fight begun the moment the Boltons betrayed Robb Stark. At dawn, the columns departed Winterfell. Sansa rode near the front, beside Brienne of Tarth and Ser Tan with a small honor guard. Stannis and his top commanders took the lead, their banners snapping in the frigid wind. Snow had begun falling again, soft but persistent. Behind them, wagons carried supplies for what might become a siege. The pace was cautious, for the roads were treacherous. Drifts of snow piled in hollows and ice coated the narrow tracks. Scouts fanned out ahead, searching for signs of Bolton ambushes. Throughout the journey, Sansa stole glances at the bleak northern sky, memories swirling within her. She recalled how she used to think the North was as safe as any place could be until the War of the Five Kings changed everything. Now, she traveled these roads as a leader, not a frightened girl. She felt the weight of that responsibility with every hoofbeat. Brienne, riding at her right, offered silent support, occasionally scanning the horizon for threats. They passed through small villages, many of them half-abandoned. The sight of soldiers in such numbers drew the weary villagers out of their hovels, some pressing hands to their hearts in awe or fear. Sansa sometimes dismounted to speak with them, to promise the end of Bolton cruelty. Many responded with quiet gratitude, some simply stared, too hollowed out by hardship to muster faith. But a few old men or young children knelt to Sansa, proclaiming "The North remembers," in tremulous voices that made her eyes sting with tears. It was a phrase she heard more and more as the host advanced, an echo of all that House Stark had meant and could mean again. After many days of careful travel, the land around them shifted. The road curved toward the cold White Knife, east of which lay the approach to the Dreadfort. Scouts reported that Bolton outriders had been sighted, but they fled rather than engage. The countryside here was bleak, dotted with sparse trees and frozen marshes. By the time the army halted to set camp under a leaden sky, tension hung in the air like an oncoming storm. Under heavy gray tents, Stannis and Sansa convened a war council. A crude map of the Dreadfort lay on a makeshift table. Torches sputtered, casting dancing shadows over the huddled figures, knights, wildling leaders, northern lords. One tall, bearded man with the badge of House Glover pointed at the fortress's outer walls, explaining that the approach from the north was particularly difficult with moats and spiked ditches. Another man, wearing Mandoli colors, insisted that the southern approach might be better, though it offered little cover. Stannis, arms folded, listened intently. Sansa's gaze rested on the Dreadfort's silhouette drawn on the parchment. She had never visited that stronghold, and she had no desire to see its fabled torture chambers. Yet it stood as the last bastion of Bolton power. I propose we surround it as completely as we can, cutting off any hope of relief or escape, she said. Ramsay cannot have many men left. If he sees no chance to break out, he may surrender. Or try something reckless. Stannis offered a curt nod. Agreed. We'll approach from two sides, one force from the north, one from the south. Let them see our banners in every direction. He swept his gaze across the circle. Be wary of traps. Ramsay Bolton is cunning. There may be hidden pits or booby-trapped gates. We do not give him a single opening. That night, the army encamped in the open fields about a league from the Dreadfort. Sentries patrolled with torches, watchful for any Bolton raid. Sansa lay in her tent, the canvas walls lit faintly by a small brazier's glow. The ground beneath her pallet was hard and cold despite layers of furs. Sleep came fitfully. She kept imagining Ramsay lurking outside, eyes gleaming with sadistic glee. In the darkest hours, she rose and pulled on a cloak, stepping outside for a breath of air. The sky was thick with swirling snow, the moon a pale blur. All around, men and women dozed or huddled in quiet clusters by small fires. The hush of the winter wind was broken only by the occasional murmur or the crunch of boots on icy ground. In a distant corner of camp, she glimpsed Melisandre standing alone, arms raised as if beseeching the sky. The faint glow of her brazier turned the falling snowflakes to sparkles in the dark. Sansa did not approach. She had no appetite for the Red God's mysteries. Instead, she walked to the perimeter and gazed eastward toward the direction of the Dreadfort. A line of towering shadows suggested thick walls and formidable gates. That was where her nightmares found shape, but also where they might end if this campaign succeeded. She whispered a soft prayer to her old gods, or perhaps to the wind itself, and returned to her tent. Come dawn, the host advanced. Battle lines formed, though they did not mount a direct assault. Instead, per the plan, the northern contingent looped around, forging a wide arc so that by midday they stood behind the castle. Meanwhile, Stannis led the southern approach with Sansa near his side, though guarded by a ring of loyal knights. They unfurled the banners of the crowned stag and the dire wolf, letting them whip in the cold gusts so the defenders on the ramparts could see. The Dreadfort's walls rose dark and imposing from the snowy ground. No welcoming horns, no attempt to parley, only silence. Figures could be seen moving along the battlements, but they made no signal. A single flayed man banner drooped from a tower, tattered by the wind. Stannis ordered a messenger forward under a white flag. The man rode close enough for his voice to carry. In the name of King Stannis Baratheon, rightful ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, and Lady Sansa Stark of Winterfell, we demand the surrender of the Dreadfort. Lay down your arms and you will receive fair treatment. The messenger's words echoed over the frozen moat. For a time, nothing happened. Then a single arrow hissed from the ramparts, striking the snow near the messenger's horse. It quivered, half buried, a silent rejection. The messenger hastily rode back amid mutters from the assembled troops. It was no surprise, Ramsay's cruelty knew no reason, but Sansa felt her stomach tighten nonetheless. This would not end peacefully. Throughout the day, Stannis's engineers began constructing siege equipment. The ground, though frozen, allowed for the digging of shallow trenches where archers could take cover. Sansa observed from a vantage point, flanked by Brienne and other knights. She could see movement along the Dreadfort's walls, occasionally glimpsing a figure who might have been Ramsay himself, pacing like a caged beast. Here and there, Bolton men fired a few arrows down, but at this range, the barrage was sporadic and mostly harmless. The real fight would come once the siege towers and rams were in place. Night fell, and the wind picked up, howling across the open ground. Fires dotted the siege lines, warding off frostbite as best they could. Sentries patrolled restlessly, scanning for a Bolton sally. None came. Perhaps Ramsay had too few men for a real sortie, or perhaps he was biding his time. Sansa drank hot broth from a tin cup, trying to quell the shivers in her limbs. Even the thick furs and woolen cloak felt inadequate against the harsh northern night. Yet she endured, heart-hardened by all she had faced. At sunrise, the first real exchange began. Bolton archers on the walls unleashed a coordinated volley at the besieging engineers and workers who continued building rams. Several men were struck, pinned to the cold ground with black-shafted arrows. Stannis' forces answered with their own barrage, though the defenders had the advantage of higher walls. Catapults had not yet been constructed, but ballistae fired large bolts that clattered off stone ramparts or skewered defenders who peered too high. The ring of steel on steel echoed as men advanced to set up ladders, testing the fortress's response. A wave of Bolton arrows drove them back. Sansa paced behind the lines, listening to the cries of the wounded. She forced herself not to look away. These men had come to end her family's torment. She offered what small comforts she could, instructing the maester and medics to give them priority care. Guilt gnawed at her. She was no stranger to war's horror, but seeing it unfold for her sake was a grim burden. She was determined that none of their sacrifices would be in vain. As the day stretched on, the standoff continued. Bolton defenders seemed fewer in number than expected, but they utilized cunning tactics, setting parts of the outer yard aflame with pitch-laden trenches. Whenever an attacker neared the walls, they unleashed a cascade of hot oil or fired crossbow bolts from hidden slits. Yet progress was made. Stannis' men secured a forward position near the southwestern tower, building a makeshift barrier to protect the siege engines. A few bold free folk, under Tormund's command, crept closer to the moat, searching for weaknesses. Tormund returned with word of an unguarded culvert that might allow a small team to infiltrate and open a sally port from inside. A dangerous plan, but potentially decisive. In council that evening, Stannis weighed the infiltration idea. The risk was high. Ramsay might have rigged that passage with traps. But if it succeeded, it could open the way for a swift strike. Sansa listened, her hands clasped, thinking of the thousands of men facing a protracted siege in the dead of winter. "We have to consider it," she said, voice calm. "The longer we wait, the more likely it is that Ramsay will devise new horrors. We want to minimize bloodshed." Stannis considered her words. "Agreed. We'll attempt the culvert infiltration at the next moonless night, which is 2 days hence. Tormund will lead the free folk, along with some of my most capable men. A small force only. If they succeed, we storm the gate. If they fail, we revert to a standard siege." He turned to Sansa. "You'll remain with the main host, of course." She inclined her head. "Understood." Then a hush fell as Melisandre spoke up, her voice echoing strangely in the torchlit tent. "I have looked into the flames. The outcome remains uncertain, but I see images of red snow and shadows twisting on the ramparts. Be wary, my king." Stannis' jaw tightened. "I am always wary. We will proceed." Over the following days, siege lines crept closer. Ladders and towers were readied. Bolton defenders hurled insults, but the exchanges of arrows and bolts thinned their ranks. The tension was a living thing, swirling through the swirling snow that drifted incessantly, dusting bodies and broken siege parts with a white shroud. On the day of the infiltration, Tormund and a hand-picked group of 24 free folk and Baratheon soldiers prepared under cover of dusk. Clad in dark cloaks, carrying rope, grappling hooks, and short blades, they slipped away from the main lines. Sansa watched them vanish into the gloom with a sense of dread. She stood near a brazier that did little to warm her, listening to the flapping of the dire wolf banners overhead. If the infiltration failed, Ramsay might slaughter them. But if it succeeded? Hours passed, agonizingly slow. The moonless sky was black as pitch, speckled only by faint stars. Sentries circulated, sometimes exchanging hushed words. Stannis stood near a cluster of mounted knights, all armed and ready to charge should Tormund's party open a gate. Sansa could see the plumes of the horse's breath, ghostly in the darkness. She could feel the tension thrumming in the air and unspoken readiness for violence. Then, near the southwestern tower, a cry arose. Distant shouts echoed from within the dread fort's walls. Torchlight flickered in windows. Sansa's heart pounded. She strained her eyes, searching for a sign. Moments later, a clang reverberated. Some hidden mechanism had been triggered. Then, with a rumble, a section of the outer gate near that tower began to rise, or so it seemed. Stannis seized the moment. "Now! Forward!" he barked. Trumpets blared and the army surged to life, men sprinting through the snow toward the southwestern gate. Sansa, shielded by her guard, followed at a safer distance. The pounding of hooves and the roar of voices filled the night. Bolton defenders on the walls scrambled to respond, but a wave of Baratheon knights crashed into the outer courtyard. Tormund's infiltration had apparently worked. Sansa glimpsed him in the gloom, waving a blood-stained axe. Chaos erupted. Within the courtyard, hand-to-hand combat raged. Bolton men formed ragged lines, but they were outnumbered, battered by the infiltration from within and the cavalry pouring in from outside. The clash of steel echoed in the gloom. Fires started as torches were kicked aside, setting small storehouses aflame. Arrows whistled overhead. Sansa's force pressed on, carving a path further into the fortress. She stayed back from the thickest fighting, aware that her death would unravel the moral center of their cause, but she refused to cower completely. Brienne was at her side, sword glinting. The defenders tried to hold the main keep, but Stannis's men battered down doors, overcame halls thick with the stench of fear. Sansa followed in their wake, stepping over bodies, hearing pleas for mercy or guttural screams. Her stomach churned. War was a monstrous affair. Yet she pressed forward, determined to see the end of the Boltons' reign. At last, near the keep central hall, a small group of Bolton soldiers made a final stand. Some wore worn surcoats bearing the flayed man. They fought savagely, driven by terror or loyalty to their lord. One by one, they fell beneath the blades of northern knights and free folk. As the smoke cleared, Sansa heard a familiar voice ring out in maniacal laughter from an adjoining corridor. Her blood ran cold. Ramsay Bolton. She moved closer, flanked by Brienne, stepping over a broken door. The corridor beyond was littered with bodies, blood painting the stone. Ramsay stood at the far end, sword in one hand, a short dagger in the other. His black hair stuck to his forehead and a twisted grin bared his teeth. Two of Stannis's soldiers lay at his feet, unmoving. Another approached him warily, but Ramsay lunged with startling speed, driving his blade into the man's throat. The soldier collapsed, gurgling. "Stay back," roared Brienne as she saw Sansa edging forward. She raised her sword, ready to protect her lady. Ramsay seemed beyond reason, eyes wild. Well, well, he called, voice echoing. "Look who's come to see me." Little dove out of her cage. He laughed, a sound that sent ice through Sansa's veins. "Come to finish me off, have you?" Before Brienne or any of the knights could close, Ramsay hurled his dagger with a vicious snap of his arm. It flew through the smoky air, and Brienne managed to deflect it with her sword, but the momentary distraction let Ramsay spin and run deeper into the corridor. "After him," barked one of the knights. They gave chase, boots pounding. Sansa followed, heart hammering, though Brienne urged her to stay back. She could not just stand there. They wound through twisted passages lit by sputtering torches. Screams and clangs echoed from other parts of the keep, but Sansa focused on the fleeting shadow of Ramsay. She caught glimpses of him turning corners, his boots skidding on blood-slick floors. Soldiers behind and around Sansa spread out, trying to block his escape routes. He was cornered eventually in a small courtyard ringed by high walls. The night sky showed overhead, swirling snow drifting into the enclosed space. A locked gate on one side prevented further flight. Ramsay spun to face his pursuers. Stannis, sword in hand, arrived from another entrance. Tormund, panting, blocked an archway. A half-circle of armed men and women closed in, including Brienne, blade raised. Ramsay's chest heaved, blood smeared on his leathers. Sansa stepped through the ring of soldiers to stand beside Brienne, ignoring the warrior's frantic attempts to hold her back. She locked eyes with Ramsay. He laughed, ragged and unhinged. "You think you've won? The North is mine, you worthless girl." "My father." "Your father is not here to save you," Sansa said, voice trembling but resolute. "No one is coming to save you." A flicker of true fear crossed Ramsay's face, quickly replaced by defiance. "Then at least I'll kill one more Stark before I go." He lunged, sword aimed at Sansa, but Brienne intercepted him with a powerful slash. Sparks flew as their blades clashed. Ramsay spat curses, twisting like a snake. Another soldier thrust a spear from behind, but Ramsay dodged aside, scoring a shallow cut on Brienne's arm. Yet he was outnumbered and trapped. Finally, with a brutal overhead strike, Brienne knocked Ramsay's sword aside. He stumbled, and a blow from Tormund's axe slammed into his shoulder, sending him to his knees with a strangled cry. The courtyard fell silent but for his ragged breathing. Sansa stepped forward. She could see the terror in Ramsay's eyes now that he realized there was no escape. King Stannis approached, eyes cold. "Ramsay Bolton, you have committed high treason, murder, and worse. The realm has no place for the likes of you." Ramsay glared up, face twisted in hate. Blood trickled from his lips. "If I die, your precious kingdom rots. My father will, eh?" A crossbow bolt hissed from behind the circle, punching through Ramsay's chest. He gasped, eyes wide, the words dying in his throat. He toppled, blood pouring from the wound. All eyes turned to see who fired. It was one of the free folk archers, face set in grim satisfaction. That's for the people you flayed, he muttered. A hush descended on the courtyard as Ramsay Bolton lay still, his final breath steaming in the cold air. Sansa stared at the body, an overwhelming rush of relief, revulsion, and sorrow for every life he had destroyed. She did not weep. She simply stood numb as the men around her let out murmurs of victory or spat on Ramsay's corpse. Brienne put a steadying hand on Sansa's shoulder, and the younger woman exhaled a long, shaky breath. The Bolton terror was ended. Across the fortress, the last pockets of resistance fell swiftly when word spread that Ramsay was dead. Some men surrendered on the spot while a handful tried to flee and were cut down. Stannis ordered the flayed man banners torn down and burned. In the keep's main hall, his soldiers and Sansa's knights raised the dire wolf and the crowned stag. The glow of torches lit the gloom, revealing centuries of Bolton cruelty etched in the architecture. Sansa resolved that if possible she would see the Dreadfort's darkest rooms dismantled, freeing the north of those horrors. As dawn broke, the castle was well and truly taken. A ragged cheer rose from the victorious army. Sansa walked through the halls in a daze, hardly believing it was done. King Stannis found her near a window overlooking the courtyard where Ramsay fell. Bloodstains marred the fresh snow. "It is finished," he said. "The Dreadfort is yours. The Boltons' claim is shattered." She turned, meeting his gaze. In that moment, she recognized that Stannis expected gratitude or perhaps a reaffirmation of her fealty. Yet she also saw something else. A trace of weariness. A sense that his own quest for the Iron Throne was far from over. She inclined her head. "My people and I are indebted. House Stark will not forget your aid." He gave a curt nod, and for a fleeting heartbeat, it seemed they shared a mutual respect. Then he turned away, already thinking of the next battle, the next step in his campaign. Sansa watched him go, a swirl of conflicting emotions within her. She was free of the Boltons, free to rebuild the North under her family's name. But she knew that Stannis's war for the Iron Throne might soon pull him away, or even demand more from the North than she was willing to give. She prayed that the alliance would hold, that the new friendship between the crowned stag and the direwolf would not unravel under the weight of southern ambitions. That evening, a makeshift feast was held in the Dreadfort's great hall, though it was more a grim repast amid the smell of blood and burning banners. Soldiers drank, toasting fallen comrades and victory alike. Tormund boasted of his infiltration, earning hearty laughs. Brienne and Ser Elstan oversaw the wounded, ensuring those who fought bravely were tended with due respect. In one corner, Melisandre quietly observed, her red robes stark against the stone walls. She neither gloated nor exulted. She simply watched the flames in the torches, as though reading omens in each flicker. Sansa sat at a high table beside Stannis, though they did not talk much. Her gaze wandered the hall, her thoughts 1,000 leagues away. She remembered how once, as a girl, she had wanted to visit all the grand castles of the 7 kingdoms, see their beauty and history. The Dreadfort, she reflected bitterly, was a place of nightmares, and she wished she had never had cause to set foot here. But if her presence had helped end House Bolton's tyranny, so be it. Tomorrow, she would return to Winterfell, bringing with her the good news that the Boltons' last great seat was broken. She would ensure the North understood that House Stark stood once more, unbowed. Perhaps in time the region could know peace and healing. She thought of the words she had spoken to her father's memory at the Godswood. "I hope you're proud of me, Father. I'm trying." Tonight, she could almost feel Ned Stark's gentle hand on her shoulder, telling her she had done well. And though the horizon of the future was uncertain, Stannis's ambitions, the chaos in the south, the looming threat beyond the wall, at least, for this moment, the long night of Bolton cruelty had ended. The North, bruised and battered, could look to a dawn that might bring something like hope. In the hush that followed, Sansa closed her eyes. She pictured the heart tree in Winterfell's Godswood and let herself imagine that, somewhere beyond the storms and bloodshed, her family's scattered spirits were at peace. She would carry the torch for House Stark now, forging alliances with old friends reborn, guided by the memory of a friendship between Baratheon and Stark that once toppled a dynasty and now had saved the North from its own darkest foes. The battered realm might not see an easy road ahead, but the direwolf would endure. And for the first time in what felt like years, Sansa allowed herself to believe that tomorrow could be a kinder day.